Justice comes at a price, the expensive suit announced with a smirk that cost more than Sarah Mitchell's monthly rent. The words sliced through the packed courtroom where a mother's trembling hands clutched a worn photograph of her son. 3 years of battling through the system, of double shifts and food bank visits, all coming down to this moment. In the back row of the gallery, partially hidden by shadow, a familiar figure lowered his tinted glasses, his jaw tightening at the scene unfolding before him. The Manhattan family court had seen its share of custody battles, but this one was different. Everyone knew it, from the seasoned bailiff adjusting his collar to the reporters furiously typing on their phones. Thomas Anderson, CEO of Anderson Holdings, stood tall beside his legal team, 5 attorneys strong, their briefcases worth more than Sarah's car. The air felt heavy with unspoken truths, the kind that come wrapped in dollar signs and country club memberships. The judge's gavel cut through the whispers, but couldn't silence the knowing looks exchanged between the court officers. Another David versus Goliath story, except this time, Goliath had bought the slingshot. What no one noticed was how the figure in the back row had stopped scrolling through his phone, how Robert Downey Jr.'s familiar features had hardened into the same determination that once carried Tony Stark through impossible odds. Some fights weren't about money, they were about what's right. Sarah Mitchell's fingers traced the edge of the manila folder containing 3 years of her life, overtime slips, character witness statements, and a perfect attendance record at every parenting class the system demanded. Each paper represented a sacrifice, a missed bedtime story, another night of instant noodles so she could afford the filing fees. Her son's school photos smiled up at her from the corner of her documents, a timeline of a childhood measured in courthouse visits and supervised visitations. The reality of the situation pressed down on her shoulders like a physical weight. Across the aisle, Thomas Anderson's legal team synchronized their watches, gold Rolexes catching the fluorescent light, a casual display of the power difference that had turned this custody battle into a war of attrition. Their polished shoes squeaked against the courthouse floor, the sound reminiscent of the hospital cleaning staff's footsteps from Sarah's night shifts as a nurse. Robert Downey Jr. shifted in his seat, the movement drawing a few curious glances. He'd come here following a different case, but something about Sarah's solitary figure amid the sea of power suits had caught his attention. The parallels to his own past, the struggles, the system, the desperate need for someone to simply care, resonated deeply. The lead attorney from Anderson's team approached the bench with the practiced ease of someone who treated courtrooms like corner offices. His argument flowed like expensive whiskey, smooth and intoxicating, each word carefully aged in Ivy League lecture halls. The gallery watched as he painted a picture of stability with broad strokes of privilege. Private schools, summer homes, trust funds, making Sarah's modest 2-bedroom apartment seem like a cardboard box in comparison. A young journalist in the third row typed frantically on her laptop, her face twisted in barely concealed disgust. She'd seen this story before, money speaking louder than love, statistics drowning out sacrifice. 2 law students whispered behind their notebooks, calculating how many billable hours were standing at the prosecutor's table. The math was simple. Justice had become a luxury good. Thomas Anderson leaned back in his chair, scrolling through investment reports on his phone, while his attorneys dismantled a mother's life with surgical precision. He paused only to smirk at his Rolex, as if checking how long it would take to purchase another piece of the American dream. In the shadows of the back row, Robert Downey Jr.'s eyes narrowed, recognition flickering across his features. He'd once been on the other side of that smirk, back when his own demons wore designer suits. Sarah's voice cracked as she addressed the court, each word carrying the weight of countless midnight shifts and missed holidays. Her son's favorite superhero lunchbox sat beside her feet, a worn Iron Man face smiling up at the proceedings, its optimism a stark contrast to the clinical dissection of her parental fitness taking place. The irony wasn't lost on the watching actor, whose own character's words about sacrifice echoed in his mind. The judge's expression remained neutral, but his eyes kept drifting to Anderson's legal team, their subtle nods and practiced gestures, a choreographed dance of influence. A court clerk dropped her pen, the metallic clatter punctuating Sarah's testimony like a full stop on a sentence already written. In the gallery, phones silently recorded the proceedings, tomorrow's viral content about wealth and justice already being hashtagged and captioned. Robert Downey Jr. leaned forward, his presence starting to draw more attention. A few whispers rippled through the crowd as recognition spread. He'd witnessed enough performances to know when someone was acting, and Thomas Anderson's concerned father routine wasn't even worthy of a cable TV pilot. The actor's hand moved to his phone, but not to check social media. This script needed a rewrite, and he knew exactly who to call. The first sign that something had shifted came during the court's recess. Anderson's legal team huddled near the water cooler, their confident smirks faltering as their phones buzzed in synchronized concern. A name was being whispered through the courthouse corridors, not Thomas Anderson's, but one that had headline blockbusters and gossip columns alike. Robert Downey Jr.'s presence had not gone unnoticed, and neither had the series of calls he'd made during Sarah's testimony. The young journalist who'd been documenting the proceedings suddenly found her social media notifications exploding. Her live tweets about the case had caught the attention of several prominent civil rights attorneys, their responses spreading through legal Twitter like wildfire. The hashtag number sign Justice for Sarah was trending, accompanied by clips of her testimony interwoven with quotes about equality under the law. In the conference room where Sarah sat alone during the recess, a gentle knock broke the silence. She looked up to find Robert Downey Jr. standing in the doorway, his signature-tinted glasses now hanging from his collar. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice carrying the same warmth that had won over millions of fans. But this wasn't a movie set, this was real life, and the script he held wasn't for a film. It was a statement from one of New York's most respected civil rights firms, expressing their immediate interest in her case. Anderson's lead attorney, returning from what appeared to be a tense phone call, stopped short at the sight through the conference room's glass walls. His client's victory lapel pin suddenly felt heavier as he watched one of Hollywood's most powerful actors slide a business card across the table to Sarah, whose trembling hands now held something more valuable than any designer briefcase: hope. Thomas Anderson burst into his legal team's huddle like a storm cloud in a $3,000 suit. The news of Robert Downey Jr.'s intervention had hit him harder than any market crash. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from board members and shareholders, all asking the same question: how had a simple custody case turned into a potential PR nightmare? The headlines were already starting to appear. Iron Man fights for single mom against corporate giant. The courthouse steps had transformed into an impromptu media circus. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers hunting for the juiciest story of the day. Social media influencers who normally covered celebrity fashion were now passionately explaining legal precedents about economic discrimination in family courts, their perfectly manicured hands gesturing at courthouse B-roll. Inside, Sarah's new legal team, 3 razor-sharp attorneys who had arrived within minutes of Robert Downey Jr. S. calls, spread their materials across the conference room table. Their presence alone spoke volumes. These weren't just lawyers, they were legal celebrities in their own right, the kind that Anderson's money usually kept on his side of the courtroom. The actor himself sat quietly in the corner, his focus entirely on Sarah, as she shared details that hadn't made it into the official record. The judge's chambers buzzed with activity as clerks rushed in and out, carrying stacks of newly submitted motions and precedents. A court officer whispered to his colleague that he hadn't seen this much action since the last major corruption case. In the main hallway, Anderson's lead attorney loosened his tie, watching his carefully constructed narrative begin to unravel. He'd built his career on turning courtrooms into business transactions, but this was starting to feel more like one of those superhero movies, the kind where money wasn't always the strongest superpower. The afternoon session began with an electricity in the air that made the fluorescent lights seem dim in comparison. Sarah's new legal team had spent the recess building what one court observer whispered was a nuclear bomb of precedents. Robert Downey Jr. had moved to the front row, his presence no longer a curiosity, but a declaration of war against injustice. The Iron Man lunchbox still sat by Sarah's feet, but now it felt less like a cruel irony and more like a prophecy. Thomas Anderson's attempt to leave the courthouse for an urgent business matter was thwarted by a wall of reporters and smartphones, each capturing his increasingly desperate attempts to maintain his composed facade. His legal team's usual choreographed confidence had devolved into a chaotic shuffle of papers and whispered arguments. The lead attorney's hands trembled slightly as he reviewed their previously bulletproof strategy, now full of holes that no amount of billable hours could patch. A murmur rippled through the gallery as Sarah's new counsel approached the bench, carrying evidence that had mysteriously surfaced. Documents suggesting Anderson's claims about his parental availability were as artificial as his public persona. The judge's expression shifted almost imperceptibly as he reviewed the papers, his years of maintaining judicial neutrality tested by what lay before him. Robert Downey Jr. leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Anderson. The actor had played enough roles to recognize the moment when a character realizes they're not the hero of the story. In the back of the courtroom, the young journalist's fingers flew across her keyboard, documenting what was quickly becoming not just a custody battle, but a moment of reckoning, a story about how sometimes justice needs more than money to prevail. It needs someone willing to rewrite the ending. The courtroom fell into a profound silence as Sarah's lead attorney rose, holding a tablet that seemed to weigh as heavy as the truth it contained. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone about to tip over the first domino, "we'd like to present evidence that Mr. Anderson's claims about his parental capabilities have been significantly misrepresented." The word misrepresented hung in the air like smoke before a fire. What followed was a devastating cascade of revelations. Calendar entries, private jet logs, and corporate meeting minutes painted a picture of a father who spent more time in international boardrooms than in his son's time zone. But it was the series of canceled supervised visitations, each one coinciding with golf club reservations and high-stakes poker tournaments, that caused Anderson to physically recoil in his expensive chair. Robert Downey Jr. watched the scene unfold with the intensity of someone who had witnessed both Hollywood scripts and real-life redemption stories. His eyes never left Anderson's face as the carefully constructed facade of the devoted father crumbled under the weight of his own digital footprint. The actor's presence had become more than celebrity interference. It was a reminder that some roles couldn't be bought, only earned through genuine love and sacrifice. Sarah's hands gripped the edge of her table as her son's drawings were presented to the court, artwork depicting lonely holidays and empty chairs at school events, each one dated to times when Anderson's Instagram showed him at yacht parties and celebrity golf tournaments. The young journalist in the gallery had stopped typing, her hands frozen above her keyboard, as she realized she wasn't just covering a custody battle anymore. She was witnessing the moment when money's grip on justice began to slip. Thomas Anderson exploded from his chair, his composed corporate mask finally shattering. "This is a circus," he shouted, jabbing a finger toward Robert Downey Jr. "You think bringing in Hollywood makes you a better parent? I can buy and sell this entire court." The words echoed off the walls, a damning testament to everything wrong with the system. The judge's gavel cracked like thunder, but Anderson was beyond caring about decorum now. That's when Robert Downey Jr. stood up, his movement drawing every eye in the room. "You know, Mr. Anderson," he began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had walked through both heaven and hell. "I used to think like you. That money could fix anything, buy anyone. That power meant never having to face consequences." He stepped forward, each word measured and deliberate. "But I learned the hard way that some things can't be bought, like the love of a parent who works double shifts just to buy their kid an Iron Man lunchbox." Sarah's quiet sobs punctuated the silence that followed. The actor's words had stripped away the legal veneer, exposing the raw humanity at the heart of the case. Anderson's legal team shifted uncomfortably in their seats, watching their client's mask of paternal concern dissolve into naked rage. The young journalist's tweet about the outburst was already going viral. "Billionaire shows true colors in custody battle. I can buy this court. Harsh justice for Sarah." The judge leaned forward, his expression carved from stone as he addressed Anderson directly. "Mr. Anderson, would you care to explain to this court exactly what you meant by buying it?" The question hung in the air like a sword, and every smartphone in the gallery rose to capture the moment when money finally met its match in the halls of justice. The judge's chambers had become a pressure cooker of tension as Anderson's empire crumbled in real time. His own words had triggered a series of rapid-fire phone calls from the district attorney's office, while court officers quietly positioned themselves near the exits. The young billionaire's outburst had torn open a Pandora's box of judicial scrutiny that no amount of high-priced legal maneuvering could close. "Your Honor," Robert Downey Jr. addressed the court, standing beside Sarah with the same presence that had commanded countless screens, "I'd like to submit my own testimony." The actor pulled out a worn AA sobriety chip from his pocket. "I know what it's like to have everything and nothing at the same time, to think money makes you untouchable. But I also know what real redemption looks like." His eyes met Sarah's. "It looks like a mother working overtime to buy her son a superhero lunchbox. It looks like love that can't be counted in dollars." The evidence mounted like an unstoppable tide. Anderson's business meetings during scheduled visitations, the documented attempts to bribe court officials, the systematic effort to drain Sarah's resources through endless legal delays. Each revelation struck with the precision of a master watchmaker dismantling a fraudulent timepiece, exposing the corrupt gears within. The judge's final words cut through the courtroom like a laser through fog. "This court will not be party to the purchasing of justice." He turned to Sarah, whose tears now flowed freely. "Ms. Mitchell, your dedication to your son speaks volumes more than any bank account ever could." The gavel fell one last time, not with anger, but with the quiet finality of truth prevailing over power. In the gallery, hundreds of phones captured the moment when justice proved it couldn't be bought, it could only be earned. The courthouse steps became a stage for something greater than a custody battle's end. Sarah stood in the afternoon light, her son's Iron Man lunchbox clutched to her chest, surrounded by a sea of reporters and supporters. The hashtag number Justice for Sarah had evolved into number Justice for All, spreading across social media platforms like wildfire, carrying stories of other parents facing similar battles against wealth and privilege. Robert Downey Jr.'s presence had transformed from celebrity intervention to symbolic victory. He stood slightly behind Sarah, his typical showman smile replaced by something more genuine, the look of someone who recognized that sometimes the greatest roles aren't played on screen. The young journalist who had documented the case was now trending on Twitter, her thread about the proceedings being shared by legal advocacy groups and celebrity activists alike. Inside the courthouse, Anderson's legal team quietly packed their briefcases, their designer suits somehow looking less impressive in the aftermath of Justice's triumph. The judge had already initiated an investigation into similar cases, his chambers buzzing with activity as staff began reviewing other custody battles where money might have tipped the scales. The message was clear. This wasn't just one mother's victory. It was a crack in the foundation of privilege itself. The story exploded across media platforms in ways no one could have predicted. Major news networks ran special reports on economic inequality in family courts, featuring Sarah's case as the tipping point. Legal firms across the country began offering pro bono services to parents facing similar battles, with number Justice for All becoming a rallying cry for systemic change. Robert Downey Jr.'s involvement had turned a local custody battle into a national conversation about justice and privilege. In the week following the verdict, Sarah received thousands of messages from parents fighting their own David versus Goliath battles in courtrooms across the country. Her son's Iron Man lunchbox had become an unexpected symbol of resistance, with parents bringing superhero merchandise to their own custody hearings as silent statements of solidarity. Legal aid organizations reported a surge in volunteers and donations, many citing the case as their inspiration. The young journalist's comprehensive coverage had earned her a Pulitzer nomination, but she chose to focus on establishing a nonprofit dedicated to providing legal support for single parents. In a quiet moment, she confided to her followers that watching Sarah's victory had reminded her of her own mother's similar struggle years ago, proving that some stories do more than just make headlines. They change lives. 1 month after the verdict, Robert Downey Jr. kept his promise to visit Sarah's son's school for a special assembly about justice and perseverance. The actor arrived without fanfare, carrying a new Iron Man lunchbox, this one containing his own AA sobriety chip, which he had mentioned in court. Sometimes the strongest people, he told the wide-eyed students, aren't the ones with the biggest bank accounts, but the ones with the biggest hearts. The video of his speech went viral, but it was the quiet moment afterward that truly captured hearts. Sarah's son showing the actor his homework, an essay titled, "My Mom, the Real Superhero." Thomas Anderson's empire faced investigations and scrutiny, but the real story wasn't about his fall from grace. It was about a mother's love proving stronger than money, about justice finding its conscience in an unexpected ally. The old Iron Man lunchbox now sits in a display at the newly established Family Justice Center, alongside other symbols of parents who fought and won against impossible odds. Each day, new families walk past it, drawing strength from the reminder that sometimes the greatest power isn't in having everything, but in refusing to give up on what matters most. As Sarah likes to say at speaking engagements, justice doesn't need to be bought. It just needs to be brave enough to stand up for what's right.